Tjena. Välkomna in ni som kommit in så länge. Ska vi bara skicka ut länken här. Så visar vi lite snabbare än andra. Fint att se. Nu ska vi se. Där har vi den. Sådär ja, då skickar vi ut det. Ska vi dra igång här alldeles strax. Se så allting funkar fint, det ser bra ut. What's up? Tjena ni som kommit in så länge. Tjena, vad är klockan nu? 50, vi hade 1-2 minuter till. Sen så drar vi igång. Har vi några roliga nyheter så länge? Det mesta är ganska avvaktande på Fed just nu. Vi ser att mest är det ganska avvaktande ton för tillfället. Tills vi får in Feds räntebesked här om 10 minuter helt enkelt. Vi ska se här, folk börjar tuna in lite nu. 30 stycken, det ser fint ut. Jo, känner allihopa som kommit in än så länge. Välkomna in i dagens live helt enkelt. Ni som kommit in, droppa gärna en like på videon så att den sprids snabbare så fler kan se den. Uppskattar det. Men låt oss dra igång, känner jag. Vi kan börja dra igång redan nu. Tjena allihopa, välkommen till den här dagens webinar. Vi kör webbinar varje onsdag där vi kollar teknisk analys på marknaderna som ni då kan önska aktier och index vi kollar på tillsammans. Kvällens webinar kommer vara lite mindre teknisk analys. Vi kommer kolla mycket på Fed som kommer in med räntebeskedet nu 20.00 och sedan 20.30 så väntas Powell gå live med sin stream helt enkelt och han ska då hålla tal och det brukar pågå runt i 30 till 45 minuter så förvänta oss att vi kommer köra live ungefär till 9-tiden ikväll helt enkelt. Så mycket intressant som kommer här nu. Det som vi förväntar oss det är en höjning med 0,25% från Fed. Så vi förväntar oss höjning på 0,25% och sedan får vi helt enkelt se vad det är vi får in och vilka signaler som Powell sedan skickar. För det är väldigt, väldigt viktigt vad de pratar om framtiden och liknande. Men låt oss kolla på lite tekniskt snabbt innan vi kommer in här. Vi har 2 ganska intressanta nivåer. Vi ska kolla på lite intressant här nu. Lite NASDAQ. Vi kollar lite index nu innan rapporten. Vi kollar lite index nu innan räntebeskedet. Sen så kollar vi vad som händer på räntebeskedet. Kikar lite teknisk analys en halvtimme fram till Powell och så drar vi igång där då. Idag, vi ser här nu att i förra veckan så drog vi uppåt här. Vi plockat likviditet här uppe. Så detta kan faktiskt vara en fake att den har gjort nu under veckan. Men mycket kommer hänga på Powells tal idag. Vi har ett gap här vid 13.190 som blir intressant att hålla utkik på. Vi kommer att ha ett gap här nere vid 12,9. Så är det att vi ser en stark reaktion negativt i början. Då finns det lite intressanta långmöjligheter här runt 12,9 som är lite intressant att bevaka. En imbalans som mycket väl kan bli där. Vi kommer även ha 20 i maj, den orangea linjen här som är lite stödnivå. Så är det så att vi faller på räntebeskedet här nu, så är det de här 2 nivåerna jag kommer kolla på personligen. Jag kommer inte ta någon trade, för jag tradar inte när jag livestreamar, för det blir för mycket samtidigt. Men hade jag inte livestreamat så hade jag kikat lite på 20 maj-nivån. Men jag hade nog varit lite avvaktande där, då det inte är en jättestor nedgång. Och jag hade nog med kanske kika på om den kan falla ner mot 12,9 tusen. Det är främst de nivåerna. Skulle det vara så att vi reagerar väldigt positivt och Powell, räntebeskedet och Powells tal tas emot med öppna armar och vi ser ut som vi bryter toppen här, ja men då ska vi nu upp mot minst 13,4, men det finns en bra chans att vi vill pusha upp mot 13,6. Men som jag sagt ett tag nu, jag tror vi är i ett toppenstadie av marknaderna. Vi kommer förmodligen med ganska stor sannolikhet toppa ut någonstans här mellan 13 200 till 13 700. Så detta är toppområde för marknaderna ur min syn. Jag tror att vi kommer toppa ut lite här innan vi gör en liten större dipp. Kanske ner mot de här låsen ner mot 12 000 eller 12,3. Jag tror i alla fall det kan bli lite tufft här uppe snart. Vi får se lite vad som händer i räntebeskedet. Men vi är nog i lite toppenstadie av marknaderna. Man brukar oftast säga, det finns en saying inom just investering och trading också som heter sell in May and go away. Och det är att marknaden har generellt underpresterat mot sommaren. Så vi tar sell in May and go away. Så det är ett ganska känt kännetecken. A popular stock market maxim, sell in May and go away, illustrates the seasonality of stock market gains in the first 7 months of the year and historically weaker performance of equities from May to October. Så historiskt sett, om vi kollar på historia, så har vi sett att just i maj har det varit sämre tider. Vi ser här att alla nyheterna börjar plocka upp det lite nu faktiskt. Att vi går in nu i maj, sell in May and go away. Och det är ju då att vi helt enkelt, så fast en graf här under maj, att vi brukar falla lite med maj, juni, juli. Och vi har haft en ganska bra start på detta året. Så det är faktiskt möjligt så också att det timar in lite med seasonality också på den fronten. Så hade vi någon nice chart här? Jag tror inte det. Bara sell in May returns May October. Sell in May return. Så det betyder alltså då om man hade sålt sell has been after market early 2022. Ja, sunt samma. Men i alla fall lite intressant fakta bara nu när vi ändå är uppe vid de här områdena. Vi får in räntebeskedet om 3 minuter. Måste vara psykologiskt bara. Det handlar mycket om också att folk inte är vid under sommarmånaderna, att många är iväg, så det är generellt mindre volymer i handeln och liknande. Folk säljer av innan sommaren och det handlar lite om så också. Det är oftast mindre likviditet också generellt. Men absolut, det blir också blivit lite av en grej att folk just säljer i maj. Så det finns en lite blandat bakom det faktiskt. Det har du helt rätt i. Att vi får 0,25. Det var pris in för tillfället. Så skulle det vara högre än 0,25% så kommer vi nog se en extrem volatilitet. Jag har ingen aning om marknaden kommer ta emot det positivt eller negativt. Men all större sannolikhet pekar att vi får en höjning på 0,25% här om 2 minuter. Och jag personligen känner att det kan gå 50-50 med riktning. Det kan gå hur som helst här. Ofta har vi faktiskt sett att det bör falla ganska hårt vid just räntebeskedet. Sedan så köps det upp mot Powell för att sedan falla igen. Vi får se om det händer idag. Jag för mig det var exakt så vi såg det sist helt enkelt. Så man kan ju hålla koll på stödnivåerna neråt ifall det skulle bli en liten krasch. Det är specifikt de här 2 nivåerna som jag har haft utritade ifall vi skulle falla lite hårdare. Det är 13,02 och 12,9. Så vi får se om det kan bli någon sell-off. Men som sagt, dagens räntebesked. Jag är personligen ganska neutral. Jag har inga indexpositioner för tillfället. Helt neutral index. Jag har lite aktietrades, lite shorts, lite longs. Ganska bra hedgat just nu faktiskt. Så jag trivs i mina trades personligen för tillfället. Har ganska even mix av longs och shorts faktiskt. Så det ska bli intressant vad som händer här faktiskt. Så vi har 50 sekunder kvar tills det är dags. 50 sekunder. Det ska bli spännande. Men som sagt, det roligaste idag kommer vara Powells tal. Roligaste. Där det kommer bli mest action. Vi kommer absolut se en reaktion här nu när vi får in räntebeskedet. Men det kommer att bli som mest volatil när Powell drar igång vid 2030. Det är då vi verkligen kommer att se stora rörelser på marknaderna. Men nu närmar vi oss. Vi har ungefär 20 sekunder kvar. Låt den här. Vi kommer in i 1 minute candle bara för att vi ska se reaktionen. Ingen reaktion hittills. Så. Och sedan så går vi in här. Så vi ser först. Vi kollar först hur mycket det blir. Och sedan så ser vi helt enkelt hur reaktionen är. $5,25, så vi får en höjning med 0,25 enligt förväntan. Första spontana reaktionen är positivt. Vi åker direkt upp vid motstånd här lite vid vid 13,19. Jag vet inte varför den här är motstånd. Jag har skrivit upp den innan. Ja, vi har lite tidiga bottnar här. Vi ser att den vänder exakt vid de bottnarna för tillfället. Som sagt, väldigt neutral. Vi får in med 0,25%. Det är det vi har förväntat oss. Så det är ingen större chock. Så vi har lite motstånd här. Som är lite intressant. Vi kommer motstånd här. Vi kommer motstånd här uppe. Men här, ja, skulle inte förvåna mig om vi trycks ner lite från det här motståndet faktiskt. Som vi ser just nu. Ja, men reagerar starkt först vid motståndet här vid 13,19. Fanns lite short-möjligheter där om man var snabb. Faktiskt, vi hade ganska tydligt motstånd här. Hade tidigare bottnar, gick upp, testa, blev motstånd. Så ja, det ska vi se här. Nu ska vi se. Så ja, vi ser hur det fortsätter här nu. Jag tror nog bara vi kommer att röra oss kanske. Vi kommer nog att röra oss mycket upp och ner. Helt enkelt här nu fram till igång 2030. Så inga större konstigheter här. Kom in enligt förväntan. Och ja, inga tydliga riktningar här faktiskt. Utan vi inväntar Powell. Men låt oss köra 30 minuter av lite teknisk analys nu. På lite aktier, index, råvaror, vad det nu är som ni vill se helt enkelt. Så ska vi se här. Då ska vi in där. Så där ja. Yes, men då börjar vi här. Vi börjar lite teknisk analys nu. Vi börjar lite teknisk analys. Så vi kan börja kolla på ABB. Så vi kör lite teknisk analys nu en halvtimme fram tills Powell drar igång. Har ni någonting ni vill att vi ska kolla på så kan ni skriva era önskemål i chatten. Så tar jag dem efterhand. Vi ska ta upp den där. Och här var någon som ville att vi skulle kolla på ABB. Väldigt tydlig channel uppåt. Då har vi väldigt tydlig någonting i den stilen. Hur hade jag velat sätta denna? Jag hade nog velat sätta någonting där med en fake out. Så någonting i den här stilen. Fin uptrend. Väldigt fin uptrend. Uppe på all time highs. Retesta de här tidiga topparna nu. Och vi har en del stöd här uppe. Men den är i toppen av sin trendkanal. Så det kan bli lite tufft här uppe nu. Och det kanske är att den ska i alla fall ner mot kanske 360 nivån. Kanske till och med en är botten på kanalen. För vi ser här att den har respekterat den här channeln ganska tydligt tidigare när den nått toppen av den. Så kan vara så att ABB är lite i toppenstadiet. Det är en fin uptrend. Så på sikt borde vi fortsätta uppåt. Men här nu kan absolut fortsätta stiga på uppåt. Inga långt som jag personligen har gillat jättemycket. Men det kan bli lite stöd här runt 365-360 ungefär. Finns ett stöd här som man kan bevaka. fin uptrend, men svårt att säga exakt någonting starkt här. Boost. Har vi någon fib-linje här? Det känns nästan som vi har en fib-nivå som den studsar på här nu. Vi ska se. Ja, vi ser ju att den faktiskt studsar exakt på en Fibonacci-nivå. 0,382 här. Kommer in med en earnings som är dålig. Vi faller 14% på earnings. Så vi faller 14% på earnings i boost. Vi har en lägre swing top. Ni ser här, vi hade en topp här. Och nu gjorde vi en lägre swing top här. Så mycket möjligt att det här är en ny downtrend som är på gång i aktien faktiskt. Det är mycket möjligt. Vi kan se någonting i den stilen. Mycket möjligt. Så att skulle jag nog kunna tro att vi kanske studsar kanske lite, men att den kommer jobba sig ner mot 100-nivån och 0,5 fib, botten på trendkanalen. Så jag skulle nog förvänta mig att boost kommer att falla kanske runt en 15% till ner mot 100-nivån. Där finns det dock väldigt bra stöd. Vi har en tidigare horisontell nivå, vi har Fibonacci 0,5. Vi har även 100 som blir en psykologisk stödnivå. De här jämna siffrorna har ju en tendens att bli stödnivåer, till exempel 100, 10, 1000, 200, 300. Så psykologisk stödnivå. Så mycket möjligt att vi kommer fortsätta ner mot 100. Så kan bli lite short möjligheter. Men annars lite longs att blicka på vid 100. Och så ska vi Fortnox. De kommer också in med sin rapport nu. Tyckte jag ändå läsa att den ändå var hyfsat bra. Jag har inte gått igenom hela rapporten. Men tyckte ändå att rapporten var hyfsat bra. Men det här är en aktie som är väldigt overextended. Vi är väldigt utdragna här faktiskt. Och om något så är det nog hellre varit shorta Fortnox än långa. Det känns som att vi är väldigt overextended faktiskt. Kanske i toppen snarare. Svårt att shorta den dock, då den är möjligtvis den klarar sig ändå ganska bra här uppe. Så skulle jag shorta så skulle jag kanske göra det med försöka ta en så låg risk som möjligt. Lägga mig kanske lite ovanför här och satsa kanske på en större pullback. Så kanske 1-4 risk-reward nästan. Så man kan få upp den på en wick. Någonstans där som man har haft 1-4 risk-reward. Då hade det kunnat vara värt det. Faktiskt. Om man tror att den toppar upp här. Det är väl någonting som jag hade kunnat kika på. Men jag tror ändå Fortnox kan fortsätta lite till. Men den ser ganska overextended ut. Vi har gjort ett kraftigt move. Och det kan vara dags att börja andas lite grann. Nu ska vi se. Då ska vi se. Vilken var vi där? Vi kan se Storytel. Kom in med en bra rapport idag. Vet jag. Sticker väldigt bra på den rapporten. Jag vet att vi pratar för några webinars för ni som är här varje vecka att det var lite intressant att kika på longs vid 30-nivån. När vi gjorde en dubbelbotten. Det var någonting vi pratade om nu för ungefär en månad sedan. Studsat väldigt bra sedan dess, upp ungefär 30%. Vi har lite motstånd här nu som kommer bli jobbigt. Vi har ett motstånd precis här. Men mycket möjligt att den vill i alla fall pusha upp mot 43. Och där har vi en del motstånd. Så detta är motstånd jag skulle haft koll på uppåt i Storytel. Men jag skulle förvänta mig att här vid 44 kan det bli väldigt tufft för priset. Vi har en del tidigare toppar här. Och toppar och bottnar. Vi har flera moving average som möter upp här. Så det finns väldigt mycket motstånd här. Så jag skulle förvänta mig att det kan bli lite tufft för priset i Storytel här. Men det har varit en bra lång från 30-nivån. Men detta är områden där man vill kika lite profits. Det här är inte vad jag skulle långa. Jag hade inte shortat heller. Utan det hade varit här jag skulle kika lite profit i longs. SBB kan vi kolla på. SBB studsade ju bra på rapporten, men sen föll vi tillbaka igen under tisdagen. Jag har personligen en långposition i SBB, så jag är tydlig med det. Jag har en långposition. Vi hade ett bra stöd vid 11,7 som vi studsade på först. Studsade upp ganska bra där, sen föll vi dagen efter 6%. Vi faller ytterligare 3% idag och nu är vi nere vid tidigare botten. Så vi har en del bra stöd här faktiskt. Vi gör just nu en dubbelbotten. Helt enkelt. Vi har en dubbelbotten för tillfället och det är mycket möjligt att det blir lite stöd här nu i SBB runt den här 10,8 nivån. Det var en väldigt bra chans för stöd. Det har vi. Skulle vi bryta de här bottnarna så är det väldigt bearish och vi får zooma in väldigt långt tillbaka för att hitta nästa nivåer, och det skulle ju då bli runt 10 ungefär. Runt 10 skulle vi hitta nästa stöd. Så vi är vid bra stödnivå nu i SBB. Där är vi. Vi har ett bra stöd här vid 10,8. Vi får se om vi får någon studs. Jag såg faktiskt att antalet blankare gick faktiskt ner under gårdagen och idag. Vi var uppe på 19,3 någonting. Nu är vi nere på 18,3%. Tror jag det var. Vi kan kolla upp det. Man kan ju söka upp det här blankningsregistret från Finansinspektionen. Jag tyckte så att SBB har gått ner till 18,3. Vi ska se här. Vad ligger vi på? 18,27. Vi var uppe på 19,3 tror jag det var som högst innan. Vi var uppe som högst 19,3 precis innan rapporten. Så det har faktiskt minskat lite i blankningen efter rapporten, även fast vi har fallit. Så vi får se vad som händer där. Men jag kan säga att vi är vid en stödnivå. Vi får se om den här nivån håller. Jag har personligen en långa du med häv. Ibland gör jag. I detta fallet med SBB så köper jag aktien rakt av. Jag ser ingen anledning till att använda hävstång i en aktie som SBB som rör sig mellan 5-15% om dagen. Det finns inte direkt någon jättestor anledning att använda hävstången när du har en aktie som rör sig med 5-10-15% på en dag. Det är oftast mer bara att man är girig, man vill ha mer, och det blir väldigt svårt att få in en riskhantering om du tradar SBB med häv här. Man kan trada SBB med häv här, men det är en extremt stor risk. Det kan gå emot en väldigt snabbt. Så jag personligen kör SBB här utan häv helt enkelt. Ja, det var SBB. Nu ska vi se. Vi kan kolla på guldet. Det har ju varit neutral där den senaste tiden. Vi har bara rört sidled. Sen vi fortsätter i... Där ser vi lite mer bullish ut. Lite mer bullish ut än vad det gjorde i söndags. Men jag känner mig inte jättestarkt bullish guldet här. Det gör jag inte. Hur reagerade vi nu vid 20.00? Vi studsade uppåt först väldigt kraftigt på räntebeskedet. Sen föll vi neråt. Jag gillar inga långs guld här, det gör jag inte. Kan vi fortsätta uppåt guld? Absolut kan vi det. Men jag gillar inte långa eller shorts. Det enda jag personligen kollar på i guld, det är potentiellt att långa här nere vid det här gapet vid 1930 eller ända här nere runt botten på kanalen. Det är de nivåerna jag bevakar på i guld för lite longs. Utöver det här nu, det är jättesvårt att säga någonting med en tydlig riktning, tycker jag. Jättesvårt att säga någonting med en tydlig riktning. Så jag är lite avvaktande på den fronten. Nordea. Alla banker har ju studsat en del, så det var ju dags för dem att gå ner lite. De här tyskarna, alltså, jag tappade. De här tyska... Så. Ja, vi toppar ut lite banker nu. Någonting som jag pratat en del om precis när att mycket möjligt att det är dags att vi ska dippa lite här. Jag skulle förvänta mig i alla fall att nu det jag kan fortsätta ner mot 107 nivån. Vi har lite stöd här runt 200 dagars moving average, så vi får se vad som händer med Powell idag. Mycket kan hända. Annars ska vi nu ner och stänga gapet här runt 107 i Nordea. Och potentiellt faktiskt gå lägre efter det. Detta känns som en topp. Vi har en lägre topp och det känns som vi ska gå mot en lägre low faktiskt. Så jag tror att bankerna absolut kan ha det fortsätta lite mer söderut. Det är absolut inte omöjligt att vi ser det. Kan bli lite studs här vid 107 och sedan studsa lite uppåt där. Men det ser bearish ut här nu. Moving average börjar slopa neråt. Vi börjar peka allt mer neråt, så börjar se allt mer bearish ut för Nordea här. ALB Albemarle Corporation. Aldrig hört talas om bolaget. Alltid intressant när det dyker upp några nya namn. Vi ska se, jag måste ut i weekly här för att kunna få en bra syn. Vi ska se här. Är på en ganska bra stödnivå. Kan vara en Fibonacci-nivå här, så hade det varit väldigt trevligt. Det hade vi inte. Utan den är nere vid 158. Så jag skulle säga att vi har ett bra stöd här. Det finns ett bra stöd här vid 170. Så mycket möjligt att den kan studsa på. Men sen har vi ett stöd här nere vid 154 ungefär. Gapet här, Fibonacci här. Så hela den här zonen skulle jag kalla för stöd. Så jag har nu gjort det till lite mer med stödzon, likt den här stilen. Och att vi nu är precis i toppen på den vid de här tidiga bottnarna. Så vi närmar oss en hel del stöd här nu. Den är precis kommit mot en stödnivå. Det finns lite utrymme att falla lite till. Men det kan absolut bli lite studs här när som helst. Så kan absolut vara en aktie att hålla utkik på. Där det absolut kan bli lite studs här. Vad ska vi säga? OX2 AB. Efter den här grafen uppe tidigare. Känner inte igen namnet spontant. Det blir så när man kollar på några 100 aktier i veckan. Kan inte komma ihåg alla. Men vi har en ganska tydlig. Vi har Fibonacci-nivå här som skapar stöd hela tiden. Vi har en trend som fortsätter neråt. Så skulle förvänta mig att den faller ner till de här nivåerna igen vid 65-66 här nere. Där sedan kan det bli lite studs. Kan bli lite studs ner här. Upp här mot 75. Mycket möjligt. Så ser ut som att vi faller lite till. Kan bli lite studs här sen. Inget som jag hade tyckt var jätteroligt och långa. Vi har lägre toppar hela tiden. Den är på väg mot ett bra stöd, men den ser ganska bearish ut. Vi faller 12% på earnings som inte köps upp alls. Så känns lite negativt här nu. Så vi borde gå ner. Ser ut som den vill ha fallit i alla fall till 66 nivån. Sen får man se när reagera där. Så ja, det är nu det som jag har haft utkik på. Nu ska vi se. Vad tror du om Atai? Atai, jag har ingen aning om vad Atai är, men vi kan kolla tekniskt. Vi har ett gap close här, eller ett gap rättare sagt. Jag har precis studsat ungefär 100%. Finner vi stöd vid någon fib-nivå. Första fib-nivån studsar vi lite på och så möter vi motstånd där. Skulle nu tro att den här kan falla lite till. Det skulle jag nu tro. Jag skulle säga helt 50-50. Det finns ingenting jag kan säga här med säkerhet. Den kan göra pullback ända ner till 1,5. Men jag kan även pusha på sig en gap vid 2,5. Så här skulle jag vara helt neutral. Ingenting jag säger alls här som jag tycker ser speciellt starkt ut åt något håll. Sivers Semiconductors har rapport imorgon tydligen. Inte enligt TradingView i alla fall. Då kan vara TradingView ha fel. Nu ska vi se. Sivers. Ingenting som ser positivt ut här heller. 20 med skapar motstånd. Motstånd. Ser inget positivt här spontant. Vi studsar på den sista Fibonacci-nivån. Så det finns lite stöd här runt 7,5. Var lite bottnar här. Så vi studsar på lite stöd nu för tillfället. Det gör vi. Men det är ingenting som ser jättestarkt ut. Vi har MACD här faktiskt. Det är lite intressant därför jag tog upp det nu. Lite positivitet, lite bullish momentum håller på att skapas. Så det kan bli så att vi får ett litet ryck uppåt här. Jag har nu haft koll på 20 med den här linjen här. Alltså skulle vi kunna bryta den stabilt, ja men då kan vi nu trycka på uppåt. Och närmsta motstånd kommer vara ungefär 13% upp vid 8,6. Ovanför de här topparna och det här gapet. Så det ska jag hålla koll på. Men sagt, ingenting som ser bullish ut än. Men börjar visa lite tecken på att den kanske vill studsa lite uppåt. Och återhämta sig lite efter det här stora fallet. Då hade jag haft utkik på en retrace till 8,5. Ja, det är nog det jag har haft utkik på. Powells. Aktien som aldrig lämnar oss, känns som. Oh shit. Wow. Powells bara faller. Fib hjälpte oss ingenting alls. Så den kan vi ta bort. Inget intressant. Detta är också väldigt bearish ut. Vi hade en tydlig channel som den rörde sig här. Mycket tydlig channel. Man hade kunnat långa bottnarna här. Väldigt fin channel som den hållit i många år. Långa bottnar, sälja toppen. Långa bott, sälja topp. Långa bott, sälja topp. Väldigt fin här. Vi har brutit oss undan här nu. Så det här är bearish. Kan det vara en fake out? Ja, men det här ser väldigt bearish ut. Och jag hade inte velat plocka upp den här aktien någonstans faktiskt. Det ser väldigt bearish ut. Vi har ett stort gap här vid 54 säger jag. Stort gap här vid 54 som kan bli en target. Där kanske det kan finnas lite möjligheter. Men spontant ser det väldigt bearish ut i Powells. Det tycker jag. Okej. Vi har ungefär 10 minuter till. Sen står Powell igång. Så vi ser hur många till vi kan hinna här. 9. Som sagt, 9 kan studsa här när som helst. Men efter vi bröt låsen så vi har inga riktigt starka stöd här längre. Vi har ett litet här vid 6,5 med ett starkare stöd kommer vara vid 5,7. Det ser ut som vi studsar lite här nu och mycket möjligt att vi kan studsa lite här mot 8 nivån upp hit. Men sedan så kanske får vi säga här kan bli motstånd. Vi har tidigare bottnar här som kan bli tuffa. Vi har 20 med och sen kan vi fortsätta falla neråt. Jag hade inte långat 9 här på en trade. Vill man ha bordet långsiktigt och man tror att den ska högre, ja, men då kan det vara en intressant dip buy. Men jag ser spontant ingen trade. Jag gillar jättemycket här i 9 för tillfället. Detta är ungefär channeln vi har just nu. Så den är ändå i botten av den. Okej. Nu när jag rider upp channeln så skulle det kanske göra mig lite mer bullish faktiskt. Så det är faktiskt en bra chans att vi ska studsa upp här mot 8. Mitten på kanalen där det var ett studs på ungefär 7-8-9%. Så det kan finnas lite trade-möjligheter, potential till 9, absolut. Hade jag tagit en trade hade jag lagt mig för min bra riskhantering. Ja, det hade kunnat gå ungefär 4-5% ner, 10-9% upp. Det hade absolut nu kan bli en trade. Så kan vara en kortsiktig trade ändå faktiskt. Nu när vi ser den här ändå fina channel som den reagerar i. Hört så bra vid stöden här, eller på botten tidigare. Så kan vara intressant att hålla lite utkik på 9. Hade varit kul att se det analysera Securitas som på rapport som på rapporten rörde sig dit Sinch gjorde på sin rapport förra veckan. Vi kollar Securitas och ser hur den ser ut. Den rör sig inte riktigt som Sinch, då Sinch köptes upp extremt mycket. Men nej, det här är väl ingenting jag tycker ser positivt ut. Den hade en tidigare channel här som den rörde sig i. Vi har gått upp, testat den. Det här ser ganska bearish ut. Så spontant ingenting som jag skulle gilla långa i Securitas. Vi ska förmodligen ända ner hit och testa mer, skulle jag tro. Faktiskt, jag tror nu det kommer att fortsätta att gå neråt mot och testa 80-nivån igen. Så spontant ingenting jag gillar jättemycket. Kan det återhämta sig lite, absolut. Men det känns nu ändå som den vill fortsätta neråt här. Känner Robin i läget? Det är fint, Tony. Hoppas allting är bra med dig. Kan du kolla Onkosenge? Vi kan kolla på Onkosenge. Hur man uttalar det, det vet jag fan. Jag hade en större trendlinje där. Hur valid är den egentligen? Den är inte extremt intressant. Lite valid men inte jätteintressant. Var med, ta bort allt det här känner jag. Ingen jättebra channel heller. Det är ju ett biotech, så det blir alltid svårt. Det blir alltid svårt att göra teorier, det blir väldigt mycket spontana rörelser. Ganska dålig volym i aktien också. Nej, alltså jag kan inte säga någonting här med mycket större sannolikhet om jag ska vara ärlig. Det enda kan vara det jag pratar lite om stöd och motstånd. Vi har en nivå här som var motstånd. Vi har kommit över den, vi testar den igen. Det kan vara så att vi går in under här igen. Ja, men då ska vi nu ner i kärnan här igen. Kanske ner mot 7,3. Fortsätter vi uppåt, var vi närmsta motstånd. Vi kommer att ha ett motstånd här vid 11,6. Vi kommer även ha ett motstånd här uppe. Och sedan här uppe där. Så det är väl jag hade lagt in en nivå där också. Så det är väl nivåerna uppåt som jag hade haft koll på för lite motstånd. Men ingenting här som jag är direkt starkt bullish eller bearish på faktiskt. Så ja, ganska neutral syn för mig för tillfället här, skulle jag säga. Sådär, då ska vi se. Då drar Powell igång om 5 minuter. Jag tror vi hinner med 1-2 aktier till. Är någon vi har sett flera gånger av, som flera har skrivit. SBB. Nej, SBB har inte kollat vad det gör. Sinch. Vi tar en koll på Sinch. Sen så hinner vi inte fler aktier. Sinch studsade ju väldigt bra på sin earnings. Vi fick en väldigt bra studs. Den följer först 15%. Vi studsade uppåt här efter gap closet. Jag tog själv en long trade här nerifrån. Studsade uppåt här, men vi fick en väldigt tuff motstånd vid de här tidiga topparna här och strax ovanför 20 med, och vi föll hårt på det. Jag personligen har sålt mitt innehav. Jag sålde ut mig vid 27 nivån ungefär. Så lyckas tajma min entry väldigt bra faktiskt i Sinch-traden. Vi får se lite hur Sinch fortsätter här nu. Den studsade först 4-5% idag på en bra rek från Morgan Stanley tror jag det var, men sålde av allting i princip. Möjligtvis vi ska ner och testa 20-nivån igen. Då kan jag tycka det är intressant att ta en lång igen om vi testar 20 igen. Men annars så är jag lite passiv här nu kring Sinch. Det här ser ganska bearish ut och det ser ut som att den vill ge upp allting och gå ner mot 20 igen. Vi får se vad som händer. Jag har lite långsiktiga positioner i Sinch, men min trade-position har jag stängt för tillfället. Vi hinner en aktie till, och den sista aktien vi kan ta. Vi kan kolla på Taiwan Semiconductors. Det var faktiskt länge sedan jag kollade på dem. Det var faktiskt länge sedan jag kollade på Taiwan Taiwan.tsm. Okej. Vi tar bort den här helt. Kommer ner till en, så är det en fib, nej inte en fib-nivå. Svårt här. Ser ut som vi har fått en ny trend neråt. Ser ut som vi har fått en ny trend neråt och vi ska fortsätta falla helt enkelt. Det gör det. Jag tycker inte det ser jättepositivt ut. Någonting i den stilen. Kan studsa lite, men skulle nu tro att den kan fortsätta trenda neråt faktiskt. Det är mycket geopolitik kring Taiwan också, osäkerhet där. Så mycket osäkerhet, så jag har nog varit osäker här. Kan studsa lite, men kommer förmodligen trenda neråt. NASDAQ, nu innan Powell, vad är det som händer? Vi pumpar lite uppåt för tillfället. Vi pumpar uppåt. Först ner där, sedan gick vi ner till 13,12 nivån där, upp här nu, och vi ska nu få igång Powell här nu alldeles strax. Jag ska se här nu om man har dragit igången. Jag ska ta upp videon. Ska vi se om Powell har börjat prata än så länge. Och det ser inte ut som att Powell har dragit igång än. Vi väntar fortfarande på han. Men ja, jag håller lite utkik på Powell, så kan vi kolla på lite fler aktier så länge. Så jag håller utkik på Powell, så när han drar igång så kommer vi switcha över. Men för tillfället så är han inte igång helt enkelt. Vi ska se här. Oj, nej, nu kommer han in. Håll den.
All right, Claudia, thank you so much. Fed Chair Jerome Powell heading to at the podium now. Let's listen in to what he has to say.
Hör ni ljudet bra nu?
Before discussing today's meeting, let me comment briefly on recent developments in the banking sector.
Ljudet bra?
Conditions in that sector have broadly improved since early March, and the U.S. banking system is sound and resilient. We will continue to monitor conditions in the sector. We're committed to learning the right lessons from this episode, and will work to prevent events like these from happening again. As a first step in that process, last week we released Vice Chair for Supervision Barr's review of the Federal Reserve's supervision and regulation of Silicon Valley Bank. The review's findings underscore the need to address our rules and supervisory practices to make for a stronger and more resilient banking system, and I'm confident that we will do so. From the perspective of monetary policy, our focus remains squarely on our dual mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I understand the hardship that high inflation is causing, and we remain strongly committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal. Price stability is the responsibility of the Federal Reserve. Without price stability, the economy does not work for anyone. In particular, without price stability, we will not achieve a sustained period of strong labor market conditions that benefit all. Today, the FOMC raised its policy interest rate by a 1/4 percentage point. Since early last year, we've raised interest rates by a total of 5 percentage points in order to attain a stance of monetary policy that is sufficiently restrictive to return inflation to 2% over time. We are also continuing to reduce our securities holdings. Looking ahead, we'll take a data-dependent approach in determining the extent to which additional policy firming may be appropriate. I will have more to say about today's monetary policy actions after briefly reviewing economic developments. The U.S. economy slowed significantly last year, with real GDP rising at a below-trend pace of 0.9%. The pace of economic growth in the first quarter of this year continued to be modest at 1.1%, despite a pickup in consumer spending. Activity in the housing sector remains weak, largely reflecting higher mortgage rates. Higher interest rates and slower output growth also appear to be weighing on business fixed investment. The labor market remains very tight, Over the first 3 months of the year, job gains averaged 345,000 jobs per month. The unemployment rate remained very low in March at 3.5%. Even so, there are some signs that supply and demand in the labor market are coming back into better balance. The labor force participation rate has moved up in recent months, particularly for individuals aged 25 to 54 years. Nominal wage growth has shown some signs of easing, and job vacancies have declined so far this year. But overall, labor demand still substantially exceeds the supply of available workers. Inflation remains well above our longer-run goal of 2%. Over the 12 months ending in March, total PCE prices rose 4.2%. Excluding the volatile food and energy categories, core PCE prices rose 4.6%. Inflation has moderated somewhat since the middle of last year. Nonetheless, inflation pressures continue to run high, and the process of getting inflation back down to 2% has a long way to go. Despite elevated inflation, longer-term inflation expectations appear to remain well anchored, as reflected in a broad range of surveys of households, businesses, and forecasters, as well as measures from financial markets. The Fed's monetary policy actions are guided by our mandate to promote maximum employment and stable prices for the American people. My colleagues and I are acutely aware that high inflation imposes significant hardship as it erodes purchasing power, especially for those least able to meet the higher costs of essentials like food, housing, and transportation. We are highly attentive to the risks that high inflation poses to both sides of our mandate, and we are strongly committed to returning inflation to our 2% objective. At today's meeting, the committee raised the target range for the federal funds rate by a 1/4 percentage point, bringing the target range to 5 to 5.25%. And we're continuing the process of significantly reducing our securities holdings. With today's action, we have raised interest rates by 5 percentage points in a little more than a year. We are seeing the effects of our policy tightening on demand in the most interest rate sensitive sectors of the economy, particularly housing and investment. It will take time, however, for the full effects of monetary restraint to be realized, especially on inflation. In addition, the economy is likely to face further headwinds from tighter credit conditions. Credit conditions had already been tightening over the past year or so in response to our policy actions and a softer economic outlook. But the strains that emerged in the banking sector in early March appear to be resulting in even tighter credit conditions for households and businesses. In turn, these tighter credit conditions are likely to weigh on economic activity, hiring, and inflation. The extent of these effects remains uncertain. In light of these uncertain headwinds, along with monetary policy restraint we've put in place, our future policy actions will depend on how events unfold. In determining the extent to which additional policy firming may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account the cumulative tightening of monetary policy, the lags with which monetary policy affects economic activity and inflation, and economic and financial developments. We will make that determination meeting by meeting based on the totality of incoming data and their implications for the outlook for economic activity and inflation. And we are prepared to do more if greater monetary policy restraint is warranted. We remain committed to bringing inflation back down to our 2% goal and to keep our longer-term inflation expectations well anchored. Reducing inflation is likely to require a period of below-trend growth and some softening of labor market conditions. Restoring price stability is essential to set the stage for achieving maximum employment and stable prices over the longer run. To conclude, we understand that our actions affect communities, families, and businesses across the country. Everything we do is in service to our public mission. We at the Fed will do everything we can to achieve our maximum employment and price stability goals. Thank you. I look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Gina.
Kolla NASDAQ. NASDAQ gillar det.
Hi, Gina Smilik, New York Times. Thanks for taking our questions. I wonder if you could tell us whether we should read the statement today as a suggestion that the committee is prepared to pause interest rate increases in June. And I also wonder if the Fed staff has in any way revised their forecast for a mild recession from the March minutes. And if so, what a recession like what they're envisioning would look and feel like when it comes to, for example, the unemployment rate.
Mycket viktig fråga här.
So, taking your question, of course, today our decision was to raise the federal funds rate by 25 basis points. A decision on a pause was not made today. You will have noticed that in the statement from March, we had a sentence that said the committee anticipates that some additional policy firming may be appropriate. That sentence is not in the statement anymore. We took that out, and instead we're saying that in determining the extent to which additional policy firming may be appropriate to return inflation to 2% over time, the committee will take into account certain factors. So that's a meaningful change that we're no longer saying that we anticipate. And so we'll be driven by incoming data, meeting by meeting, and we'll approach that question at the June meeting. So the staff's forecast is so. Let me start by saying that that's not my own most likely case, which is really that the economy will continue to grow at a modest rate this year. And I think that's so different people in the committee have different forecasts. That's my own assessment of the most likely path. Staff produces its own forecast, and it's independent of the forecasts of the participants, which include the governors and the Reserve Bank presidents, of course. And we think this is a healthy thing, that the staff is writing down what they really think. They're not especially influenced by what the governors think, and vice versa. The governors are not taking what the staff says and just writing that down. So it's actually good that the staff and individual participants can have different perspectives. So broadly, the forecast was for a mild recession, and by that I would characterize as one in which the rise in unemployment is smaller than has been typical in modern era recessions. I wouldn't want to characterize the staff's forecast for this meeting. We'll leave that to the minutes, but broadly similar to that.
Rachel. Thank you, Chair Powell. Rachel Siegel from the Washington Post. Thanks for taking our questions. I'm wondering if you can talk about the account of possible effects of a debt limit standoff. You've said repeatedly that the ceiling must be raised, but do you see any economics effects of even getting close to a default? And what type of situation would that look like?
So I wouldn't want to speculate specifically, but I will say this. These are fiscal policy matters, for starters, and they're for Congress and the administration, for the elected parts of the government to deal with, and they're really consigned to them. From our standpoint, I would just say this. It's essential that the debt ceiling be raised in a timely way so that the U.S. government can pay all of its bills when they're due. A failure to do that would be unprecedented. We'd be in uncharted territory, and the consequences to the U.S. economy would be highly uncertain and could be quite averse. So I'll just leave it there. We don't give advice to either side. We just would point out that it's very important that this be done. And the other point I'll make about that, though, is that no one should assume that the Fed can protect the economy from the potential, short and long-term effects of a failure to pay our bills on time. It would be so uncertain that it's just as important that we never get to a place where we're actually talking about or even having a situation where the U.S. government's not paying its bills.
And just to follow up, was discussion around the uncertainty of a possible standoff, did that affect today's monetary policy decision at all?
I wouldn't say that it did. It was, of course, it's something that came up. We talk a lot about risks to the outlook, and that come up. A number of people did raise that as a risk to the outlook. I wouldn't say that it was important in today's monetary policy decision yet.
Steve.
Chairman. Oh, thank you. Yeah, Steve Leisman, CNBC. Can you tell us what the Federal Reserve Board did in the wake of that February presentation where you were informed that Silicon Valley Bank and other banks were experiencing interest rate risks. And can you tell me what supervisory actions you've done in the wake of the recent bank failures to make sure that banks are currently appropriately managing interest rate risk? And kind of part three, but it's all the same question here. Do you still think this separation principle that monetary policy and supervision can be handled with different tools? Thank you.
Sure. So the February 14th presentation, I didn't remember it very well, but now, of course, I've gone back and looked at it very carefully. I did remember it. And what it was a general presentation. It was an informational briefing of the whole board, the entire board. I think all members were there. And it was about interest rate risk in the banks and lots of data. And there was one page on Silicon Valley Bank which talked about the amount of losses mark-to-market losses they had in their portfolio. There was nothing in it about, that I recall anyway, about the risk of a bank run. So it was, I think the takeaway was they were going away to do an assessment, a horizontal assessment of banks. It wasn't presented as an urgent or alarming situation. It was presented as an informational, non-decisional kind of a thing, and I thought it was a good presentation, and as I said, did remember it. In terms of what we're doing, of course, I think banks themselves are many banks are now are attending to liquidity and taking opportunity now, really since the events of early March to build liquidity. You asked about the separation principle. Like so many things, it's very useful. But ultimately, it has its limits. I mean, I think in this particular case, we have found that the monetary policy tools and the financial stability tools are not in conflict. They're working well together. We've used our financial stability tools to support banks through our lending facilities, and at the same time, we've been able to use our monetary policy tools to foster maximum employment and price stability.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry. I don't mean to be argumentative, but the staff report said SVB has significant interest rate risk. It said interest rate risk measurements failed at SVB, and it said banks with large unrealized losses face significant safety and soundness risk. Why was that not alarming?
Well, I mean, I didn't say it wasn't alarming. It was they're pointing out something that they're working on and that they're on the case. That I'm not sure whether they mentioned. I think they did actually. They mentioned that they had taken regulatory action, or supervisory action in the form of matters requiring attention. So I think that was also in the presentation. I think it was to say, yes, this is a bank, and there are many other banks that are experiencing these things, and we're on the case.
Thank you.
Go to Victoria.
Hi, Chair Powell. I wanted to ask you, obviously, with the recent bank turmoil, we've seen multiple banks buy other banks, and I was just curious whether you think that further consolidation in the banking sector would increase or decrease financial stability, and whether you have any concerns about the biggest bank in the U.S. Getting even larger.
So, we certainly don't, and I don't have an agenda to further consolidate banks. Consolidation has been a factor in the U.S. banking industry really since interstate banking, and before that even. It goes back more than 30 years. When I was in the government a while back, I think there were 14,000 banks. Now there are 4,000 and change. So that's going on. I personally have long felt that having small, medium, and large-sized banks is a great part of our banking system. The community banks serve particular customers very well. Regional banks serve very important purposes, and the various kinds of GSIBs do as well. So I think it's healthy to have a range of different kinds of banks doing different things. I think that's a positive thing. Is it a financial? So I would just say, in terms of J.P. Morgan buying First Republic, the FDIC really runs the process of closing and selling a closed bank completely. That is their role, so I really don't have a comment on that process. As you know, there's an exception to the deposit cap for a failing bank. So it was legitimate, and I think the FDIC, I believe, is bound by law to take the bid that is the least cost bid. So I would assume that's what they did.
So, but do you have any concerns about
The fact that they're getting larger in general?
So I think it's probably good policy that we don't want the largest banks doing big acquisitions. That is the policy, and but this is an exception for a failing bank, and I think it's actually a good outcome for the banking system. It also would have been a good outcome for the banking system had one of the regional banks bought this company, and that could have been the outcome. But ultimately, we have to follow the law in our agencies, and the law is it goes to the least cost bid.
Senator Colby. Thank you. Colby Smith with the Financial Times. At the March meeting, you mentioned that a tightening of credit conditions from the recent bank stress could be equal to one or more rate increases. So given developments since then, how has your estimate changed?
Yeah, I think I followed that up by saying it's quite impossible to have a precise estimate of the words to that effect. But in principle, that's the idea. You know, when we've been raising interest rates, and that raises the price of credit, and that, in a sense, restricts credit in the economy, working through the price mechanism. And you know, when banks raise their credit standards, that can also make credit tighter in a kind of broadly similar way. It isn't possible to make a kind of clean translation between one and the other, although firms are trying that, and you know, we're trying it. But ultimately, we have to be honest and humble about our ability to make a precise assessment. So it does complicate the task of achieving, you know, a sufficiently restrictive stance. But I think conceptually, though, we think that you know, interest rates, in principle, we won't have to raise rates quite as high as we would have had this not happened. The extent of that is so hard to predict because we don't know how persistent these effects will be. We don't know how large they'll be and how long they'll take to be transmitted. But that's what we'll be watching carefully to find out.
Just to quickly follow up, what does it suggest about the scope for the committee to pause rate increases perhaps as early as next month, even if the data remains strong then, if it's having some kind of substitute effect?
This is just something that we have to factor in as we want to find ourselves. So I guess I would say it this way. The assessment of the extent to which additional policy firming may be appropriate is going to be an ongoing one, meeting by meeting, and we're going to be looking at the factors that I mentioned that are listed in the statement, the obvious factors. That's the way we're going to be thinking about it. That's really all we can do. As I say, it does complicate. We have, you know, a broad understanding of monetary policy. Credit tightening is a different thing. There's a lot of literature on that, but translating it into rate hikes is uncertain. Let's say it adds even further uncertainty. Nonetheless, we'll be able to see what's happening with credit conditions, what's happening with lending. There's a lot of data on that, and you know, we'll factor that into our decision making.
Howard.
Howard Schneider with Reuters. Thank you. So noting that the statement dropped the reference to sufficiently restrictive, I was wondering, given your baseline outlook, whether you feel this current rate of 5 to 5.25% is in fact sufficiently restrictive.
So that's going to be an ongoing assessment. We're going to need data to accumulate on that. Not an assessment that we've made. That would mean we think we've reached that point, and I just think it's not possible to say that with confidence now. But nonetheless, you will know that the summary of economic projections from the March meeting showed that at that point in time that the median participant thought that this was the appropriate level of the ultimate high level of rates. We don't know that. We'll revisit that at the June meeting, and that's, you know, we're just going to have to, before we really declare that, I think we're going to have to see data accumulating and you know, make that, as I mentioned, it's an ongoing assessment.
A follow-up on credit, but could you give us a sense of what the SLUS survey indicated? It was already, you know, I think 45% of banks were tightening credit as of the last survey. What did this one show, and how did that weigh into your deliberations?
So we're going to release the results of the SLUS on May 8th, in line with our usual time frame. And I would just say that the SLUS is broadly consistent when you see it with how we and others have been thinking about the situation and what we're seeing from other sources. You will have seen the Beige Book and listened to the various earnings calls that indicate that mid-sized banks some of them have been tightening their lending standards. banking data will show that lending has continued to grow, but the pace has been slowing really since the second half of last year.
Let's go to Nick.
Nick Timmeros of the Wall Street Journal. Chair Powell, the argument around the end of last year and the beginning of this year to slow down the pace of increases was to give yourself time to study the effects of those moves. After the bank failures in March, as you've discussed, the Fed staff projected a recession starting later this year. So my question is why it was necessary to raise interest rates today, or put differently, if the whole point of slowing down the pace was to see the effects of your moves, and now you've, for the last 2 meetings, been seeing the effects of those moves. Why did the committee feel it was necessary to keep moving?
Well, the reason is that we, again, with our monetary policy, we're trying to reach and then stay at for an extended period, a level of policy stance that's sufficiently restrictive to bring inflation down to 2% over time, and that's what we're trying to do with our tool. I think slowing down was the right move. I think it's enabled us to see more data, and it will continue to do so. So we really, we have to balance. We always have to balance the risk of not doing enough and not getting inflation under control against the risk of maybe slowing down economic activity too much. And we thought that this rate hike, along with the meaningful change in our policy statement, was the right way to balance that.
And just to follow up, what you said in response to Howard's question, you'll need data to accumulate to determine if this is a sufficiently restrictive stance. Does that data need to accumulate, or could it accumulate over a longer period than a 6-week intermeeting cycle?
As I mentioned, I would just say that this assessment will be an ongoing one. You can't, with economic data, you can't. You've seen, take inflation from it. Look back. We've seen inflation come down, move back up 2 or 3 times since March of 2021. We've seen inflation have a few months of coming down and then come right back up. So I think you're going to want to see that, that a few months of data will persuade you that you've got this right, kind of thing. And we have the luxury. We've raised 500 basis points. I think that policy is tight. I think real rates are probably, you can calculate them many different ways, but one way is to look at the nominal rate and then subtract a reasonable estimate of let's say 1-year inflation, which might be 3%. So you've got 2% real rates. That's meaningfully above what most people many people anyway, would assess as the neutral rate. So policy is tight, and you see that in interest-sensitive activities, and you also begin to see it more and more in other activities. And if you put the credit tightening on top of that and the QT that's ongoing, I think you feel like we may not be far off, or possibly even at that level.
Great, thank you, Edward.
Thank you very much, Chair Powell. Edward Lawrence with Fox Business. So if the Federal Reserve gets down to the 3% inflation, as the projections show at the end of this year, or close to it, would it be okay for you for a prolonged period of 3% inflation and hoping for some outside event to move down to 2% target?
I think we're always going to have 2% as our target. We're always going to be focusing on getting there.
Would be okay with a prolonged 3%?
It's. Let me just say that's not what we're looking for. We're looking for inflation going down to 2% over time. I mean, that's not a question that's in front of us, and it would depend on so many other things. But ultimately, we're not looking to get to 3% and then drop our tools. We have a goal of getting to 2%. We think it's going to take some time. We don't think it'll be a smooth process, and I think we're going to need to stay at this for a while.
How does the other side of the mandate, the jobs side, once you get to 3%, going from 3 to 2, how does the other side of the mandate balance?
I think they will both matter equally at that point. Right now, you have a labor market that's still extraordinarily tight. You've still got 1.6 job openings, even with the lower job openings number, for every unemployed person. We do see some evidence of softening in labor market conditions, but overall, you're near a 50-year low in unemployment. wages, you all will have seen the wage number from late last week, and it's, whenever it was, and it's a couple percentage points above what would be consistent with 2% inflation over time. So we do see some softening. We see new labor supply coming in. These are very positive developments, but the labor market is very, very strong. Whereas inflation is running high, well above our goal, and right now we need to be focusing on bringing inflation down. Fortunately, we've been able to do that so far without unemployment going up.
Matt.
Hi, Chair Powell. Matthew Boesler with Bloomberg News. So many analysts noted at the time of the March FOMC meeting that at least half of Fed officials' projections did imply or seem to imply that a recession was in their baseline forecast as well, given the strong first quarter GDP tracking estimates. And so I'm just wondering if you could kind of elaborate on, why you're optimistic that a recession can be avoided, given that that's the Fed staff's forecast, possibly also the broader committee's forecast as well, and also, of course, most private sector forecasters.
Yeah, I don't think, I know what's printed in the Summary of Economic Projections and all that. I don't think you can deduce exactly what you said about what participants think, because you don't know what they were thinking for first quarter GDP at that point. They could have been thinking about a fairly low number. Anyway, in any case, I'll just say I continue to think that it's possible that this time is really different. And the reason is there's just so much excess demand, really, in the labor market. It's interesting, as we've raised rates by 5 percentage points in 14 months, and the unemployment rate is 3.5%, pretty much where it was, even lower than where it was when we started. So job openings are still very, very high. We see by surveys and much evidence that conditions are cooling gradually, but it really is different. It wasn't supposed to be possible for job openings to decline by as much as they've declined without unemployment going up. Well, that's what we've seen. So there are no promises in this, but it just seems to me that it's possible that we can continue to have a cooling in the labor market without having the big increases in unemployment that have gone with many, prior episodes. Now, that would be against history. I fully appreciate that. That would be against the pattern. But I do think that the situation in the labor market with so much excess demand, yet, wages have been moving down. Wage increases have been moving down, and that's a good sign, down to more sustainable levels. So I think it's still possible. I think. The case of avoiding a recession is, in my view, more likely than that of having a recession. But it's not that the case of having a recession is. I don't rule that out either. It's possible that we will have what I hope would be a mild recession.
The committee also noted in March that wage growth was still well above levels that would be consistent with 2% inflation. Do you see that as well? And could you kind of explain, how you come to that judgment? Sure.
So we look at a range of wage measures, and then that's a nominal. And then so you assume wages should be equal to productivity increases plus inflation. And so you can look at the Employment Compensation Index, average hourly earnings, the Atlanta Wage Tracker, compensation per hour, basically those four and many others, and you can look at what they would have to run at over a long period of time for that to be consistent with 2% inflation. They can deviate. Corporate margins can go up and down, and there is a feature of long expansions where they do go down, where labor gets a bigger share toward later in a recession. Later in expansion. So yeah, and we calculate those, and you have to take the precision with a degree of salt. But I would say that what they will show is that if wages are running at 5%, 3% is closer to where they need to be. Wage increases closer to 3%, roughly, is what it would take to be consistent with inflation over a longer period of time. By the way, I do not think that wages are the principal driver of inflation. You're asking me a very specific question. I think there are many things. I think wages and prices tend to move together, and it's very hard to say what's causing what. But I've never said that. That wages are really the principal driver, because I don't think that's really right.
Great. Chris Rugaber at Associated Press. Well, you mentioned profit margins. Those have expanded, did expand sharply during this inflationary period. And while there are some signs that they are starting to decline, many economists note they haven't fallen as much as might be expected, given that we're seeing at least some pullback among consumer spending. So, speaking of causes of inflation, do you see expanded profit margins as a driver of higher prices? And if so, would you expect them to narrow soon and contribute to reduced inflation in the coming months?
So higher profits and higher margins are what happens when you have an imbalance between supply and demand. Too much demand, not enough supply. And we've been in a situation in many parts of the economy where supply has been fixed or not flexible enough. And so, you know, the way the market clears is through higher prices. So to get, I think as goods pipelines have gotten, you know, back to normal so that we don't have the long waits and the shortages and that kind of thing, I think you will see inflation come down, and you'll see corporate margins coming down as a result of a return of full competition where there's enough supply to meet demand, and then you're really back to full competition. That would be the dynamic I would expect.
Michael McKee from Bloomberg Radio and Television. Can you tell us something about what your policy reaction function is, your policy framework is going forward? When you look at the economy at the next meeting, are you looking at incoming data, which is by definition backward looking? Are you going to be forecasting what you think is going to happen? Are you ruling out the rate cuts that the market has priced in?
I didn't catch the last part. Ruling.
Markets have priced in rate cuts by the end of the year. Do you rule that out?
Okay, I got it. So what are we looking at? I mean, we look at a combination of data and forecasts. Of course, the whole idea is to create a good forecast based on what you see in the data. So we're always looking at both, you know, and it will, of course, it'll be the obvious things. It'll be readings on inflation. It'll be readings on wages, on economic growth, on the labor market, and all of those many things. I think a particular focus for us going now over the past 6-7 weeks now, and going forward is going to be what's happening with credit tightening. Are small and medium-sized banks tightening credit standards, and is that having an effect on loans, on lending? And you know, so we can begin to assess how that fits in with monetary policy. That'll be an important thing. We'll be looking at everything. It's, again, I would just point out, we've raised rates by 5 percentage points. We are shrinking the balance sheet, and now we have credit conditions tightening, not just in the normal way, but perhaps a little bit more due to what's happened. And we have to factor all of that in and make our assessment of whether our policy stance is sufficiently restrictive. And we have to do that in a world where policy works with long and variable lags. So this is challenging, but you know, we will make our best assessment, and that's what we'll be thinking.
What about the idea of rate cuts?
Yeah, so we on the committee have a view that inflation is going to come down, not so quickly, but it'll take some time. And in that world, if that forecast is broadly right, it would not be appropriate to cut rates, and we won't cut rates. If you have a different forecast, and you know, markets have been from time to time pricing in quite rapid reductions in inflation, we'd factor that in, but that's not our forecast. And of course, the history of the last 2 years has been very much that inflation moves down. Particularly now, if you look at non-housing services, it really hasn't moved much, and it's quite stable. And so we think we'll have to. Demand will have to weaken a little bit, and labor market conditions may have to soften a bit more to begin to see progress there. And again, in that world, it wouldn't be appropriate for us to cut rates.
Courtney?
Courtney Brown from Axios. I'm curious how you view the role of the overnight reverse repo facility in the context of the current banking stress. Do you think it's contributing to the stress by making it more attractive for money market funds to compete with banks for deposits? And did the committee discuss any changes to the structure of the facility, or do you see that being put on the table in the future? Thanks.
Sure. So we looked at that very carefully, as you would imagine, and it's really not contributing. We don't think now. It hasn't actually been growing. It moved up, it moved down, and then moved back up to where it was. What happened in the when there were the big deposit flows, which by the way have really stabilized now. What happened was institutional investors took their uninsured deposits and put them in government money market funds, which bought paper from the Federal Home Loan banks and things like that. Over the course of maybe the last year, retail investors had been gradually, as they do in every tightening cycle, they've been gradually moving their deposits into higher yielding places such as CDs and other things, including money market funds. So that's a gradual process that is quite natural and happens during a tightening cycle. What was unusual really was the institutional investors moving their uninsured deposits and spreading them around and things like that. But it doesn't seem to have had any effect overall on over the overnight repo facility. That is really there to help us keep rates where they're supposed to be, and it's serving that purpose very well.
Okay, Sarah.
Sarah Ewald-Weiss, CBS News. I want to go back to the debt ceiling for a moment. I know you talked about that in terms of fiscal policy, but can you just speak towards what the impact of a default would mean for Americans across the country, the markets, and borrowing?
Yeah, I would just say it's. I don't really think we should be. We shouldn't even be talking about a world in which the U.S. doesn't pay its bills. It just shouldn't be a thing. And again, I would just say we don't. No one should assume that the Fed can really protect the economy and the financial system and our reputation globally from the damage that such an event might inflict.
Scott.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Scott Horsley from NPR. In his report last week, Vice Chair Barr identified a couple of the factors that he thought contributed to the regulatory, the supervisory lapses at Silicon Valley Bank. A policy change in 2019 to exempt all but the biggest banks from strict scrutiny, and also what he called a sort of cultural shift towards less aggressive oversight. You were here in 2019. Do you share that view, and what would it take to get the stronger oversight that you and he said in your release would be necessary?
So I didn't take part in creating the report or doing the work, but I have read it, of course, and I find it persuasive. I mean, I would say it this way: a large bank, not a very large bank, a large bank failed quite suddenly and unexpectedly in a way that threatened to spread contagion into the financial system. I think the only thing that I'm really focused on is to understand what went wrong, what happened, and identify what we need to do to address that. Some of that it may just have been technology evolving, we have to keep up with all that, but some of it may be our policies and supervisory and regulatory, whatever. What our job is now is to identify those things and implement them. And that's kind of the only thing I care about is, and I feel like
regional banks. And secondly, do you still have a bias to tighten rates? Is that what the statement is saying?
So, I guess I would say it this way. There were three large banks really from the very beginning that were at the heart of the stress that we saw in early March, the severe period of stress. Those have now all been resolved, and all the depositors have been protected. I think that the resolution and sale of First Republic kind of draws a line under that period is an important step toward drawing a line under that period of severe stress. Okay. I also think we are very focused on what's happening with credit availability, particularly with what you saw in the in the beige book, and you will see in the sluice, is small and medium-sized, small and medium-sized banks who are feeling that they need to tighten credit standards, build liquidity. What's going to be the macroeconomic effect of that? More broadly, we will continue to very carefully monitor what's going on in the banking system, and we'll factor that assessment into our decisions in an important way going forward.
Okay, Greg.
Thank you, Fed Chairman. Greg Robb from MarketWatch. I just wondered if you've done any reflection on your own actions during this crisis and leading up to it over the last, since you've been Fed Chairman. I think I've heard you say a couple of times that you deferred to the Vice Chair for supervision. Do you think that was the right way to go about this? And yeah, comments on that. Thank you.
Sure. So let me say, first of all, I've been chair of the board for 5+ years now, and I fully recognize that we made mistakes. I think we've learned some new things as well, and we need to do better. And as I mentioned, I thought the report was unflinching and appropriately so. I welcome it, and I agree with and will support those recommendations. And I do feel that I'm personally accountable to do what I can to foster measures that will address the problems. So on the Vice Chair for supervision, you know, the place to start is the statutory role, which is quite unusual. The Vice Chair, it says, shall deploy policy recommendations, develop policy recommendations for the board regarding supervision and regulation of depository institution companies, and shall oversee the supervision and regulation of such firms. So this is Congress establishing a 4-year term for someone else on the board, not the chair, as Vice Chair for supervision, who really gets to set the agenda for supervision and regulation for the Board of Governors. Congress wanted that person to have political accountability for developing that agenda. So the way it works, the way it has worked in practice for me is I've had a good working relationship. I give my counsel, my input privately, and that's, I offer that, and I have good conversations, and I try to contribute constructively. I respect the authority that Congress has deferred on that person, including working with Vice Chair Barr and his predecessor. And I think that's the way it's supposed to work, and that's appropriate. I believe that's what the law requires. And, you know, but it isn't, I wouldn't say it's a matter of complete deference. It's more, I have a role in presenting my views and discussing, having an intelligent discussion about what's going on and why, and you know, that's my input. But ultimately, that person does get to set the agenda and gets to take things to the Board of Governors, and really in supervision has sole authority over supervision.
I just wondered if you had any regrets, or was there anything that, you know, decisions that maybe you regret now in light of what's happened?
I've had a few. Sure. I mean, you know, who doesn't look back and think that you could have done things differently? But honestly, you don't get to do that. Again, my focus is on control the controllable. As one of my great mentors used to always say, control the controllable. What we control now is make a fair assessment, learn the right lessons, figure out what the fixes are, and implement them. And I think that Vice Chair Barr's report is an excellent first step in that, but we've got to follow through.
Hi there, Megan Casella with Barron's. Did the possibility of pausing at this meeting come up at all, and how seriously was that considered? I'm curious if you can give us any color as to whether there were any initial concerns about raising rates again, or what those discussions entailed.
So support for the 25 basis point rate increase was very strong across the board. I would say there are a number of people, and you'll see this in the minutes. I don't want to try to do the head count in real time, but people did talk about pausing, but not so much at this meeting. That there's a sense that we're much closer to the end of this than to the beginning. That, as I mentioned, if you add up all the tightening that's going on through various channels, we feel like we're getting close, or maybe even there. But that, again, that's going to be an ongoing assessment, and we're going to be looking at those factors that we listed and to determine whether there's more to do.
I'm curious too how to interpret that and the changes to the statement. Is the bar higher now to raise rates at the next meeting, or would a strong jobs report or inflation print be enough to push the Fed to tighten again?
I don't want to. I couldn't really say. I just think I think we've moved a long way fairly quickly, and I think we can afford to look at the data and make a careful assessment.
And we'll go to Nancy for the last question.
Hi, Chair Powell. Nancy Marshall-Genzer with Marketplace. You mentioned a few times about the lessons you learned from the banking crisis, that you would learn the right lessons. What are those lessons?
Well, I just would start with something that's changed, really, which is the run on Silicon Valley Bank was out of keeping with the speed of runs through history. And that now needs to be reflected in some way in regulation and in supervision. We know now that we know it's possible. I think no one thought that was possible. No one had. I'm not aware of anybody thinking that this could happen quite so quickly. So I think that, that will play through. It will be up to Vice Chair Barr to really take the lead in designing the ways to address that. But I think that's one thing. I guess I would just say that. Then we're gonna revisit. It's pretty clear to me anyway. It's clear that we need to strengthen both supervision and regulations for banks of this size, and I'm thinking that we're on track to do that as well.
Can you be any more specific on stress testing or looking at banks that have specific concentrations in certain parts of the economy?
Yeah, that's what Vice Chair Barr's role really is, and he'll take the lead on that.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
All right, that wraps up Fed Chair Powell's news conference here, taking a look at how the market is reacting. We're still looking at a mixed picture here, I guess, giving up some of those earlier gains that we saw ahead of Powell's comments. You're looking at the Dow off just about 130 points, S&P in the red, the NASDAQ trading just above the flat line. Again, the Fed raising rates by another 25 basis points. This was a unanimous decision. We just heard Fed Chair Jay Powell talk about the fact that there had been some talk about pausing, but there wasn't too much of that at this meeting. One of the things that stuck out to me here, Diane, was what he had to say about the stress within the banking system. And he came out the gate talking about this, saying that the banking system is sound, it is resilient, that conditions have, quote, broadly improved since March. And I think that was something that obviously the market was hoping to hear, that it wanted to hear, given some of the losses that we saw today. That stood out to me as well, that out the gate he didn't start with the policy statement. The policy statement occurred, but with regard to the press conference, he jumped right into the issues in the regional banking sector and the containment there, mimicking some things we'd heard from JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon about seeing more stability now, to paraphrase, saying conditions have improved in the banking sector. But he did acknowledge in the Q&A that there had been misses there previously, and that's what we saw with regard to that report, which was a post-mortem basically on SVB and the issues there. But getting back to the monetary policy side, he just focused on the dual mandate from the
Okej. Men vi avrundar där. Jag höll på att koppla av kameran här nu samtidigt. Snabb kommentar bara. Väldigt, väldigt neutralt från Powell faktiskt. Ingenting jättestort. Det största jag skulle ta med mig är väl att han sa att vi kommer inte sänka räntorna särskilt snart. Det är ingenting att kolla på, men det ser bättre ut än vad man tidigare trott och liknande. Overall, vi ser just nu att marknaderna säljer av lite. Det kan sluta hur som helst. Vi kan fortsätta neråt, vi kan gå uppåt. Jättesvårt att säga hur vi kommer stänga idag. Jag personligen tyckte det var ganska neutralt från Powell. Han höll sig väldigt försiktig. Han höll sig väldigt försiktig. Inte säga för mycket åt varken att man skulle sluta med att höja räntorna och heller att man inte kommer börja för tidigt med just att sänka dem heller. Så ganska neutralt för min del tycker jag. Jag tycker inte det är för mycket åt någon riktning, så det kan verkligen gå hur som helst idag. Vi vill se lite hur marknaden stänger nu och vilken riktning den vill ta när vi får smälta all information helt enkelt. Men för min syn är det ganska neutralt. Vi ser också att det handlas runt nollan också för dagen. Så ganska neutralt nu, och vi får se lite hur vi stänger. Men ja, det här var dagens webinar. Är du inte med i Discorden så hoppa med i den. Den finns överallt här, så det är bara att dyka in där, den är helt gratis. Men annars så avrundar vi dagens webinar. Det här var Robin Omega och jag säger ciao!